Hello PEI, welcome to this week's episode.
Glad to be here.
Yeah, and it has officially been 1 year since April 2025. The moment U.S. tariffs just escalated dramatically.
It was a massive shock to the system.
It really was. Usually when you look at a global economic map during a major trade war, it basically looks like a Doppler radar right in the middle of hurricane season.
Oh, absolutely. Giant angry swaths of red just hovering over major manufacturing hubs.
Right, borders flashing with warning signs, just an overall sense of impending chaos. But if you take that same map and, zoom way, way in on this tiny crescent shape in Atlantic Canada, Prince Edward Island, the radar is completely clear.
It's wild. The economic weather there isn't just surviving the storm. They are somehow using the headwind to actually sail faster.
Which is exactly what we are getting into today. We are doing a deep dive into trade wars and island resilience. And we have to start by throwing a massive thank you to show creator Mike Montague of Remax Charlottetown.
Yes. Huge thanks to Mike.
He curated this week's topic for us and provided this incredible stack of sources that offer a really nuanced glass half full perspective on the PEI economy.
Yeah, and we're looking at some fantastic material. A recent CTV News investigation, the Innovation PEI 2025 Export Growth Report, and some really heavy-hitting economic analyses from RBC and TD Economics.
Exactly. Our mission for you today is to figure out how PEI is punching so far above its weight class while, the national headlines are just screaming about trade anxiety.
Because the contrast between those national headlines and the actual regional reality on the ground is staggering. I mean, we really need to look at the mechanics of what is happening in places like Charlottetown and Montague.
Because the survival strategies they're deploying are fundamentally different from what you see in Toronto or Montreal. Right?
Completely different.
So let's jump straight into the human element of this. The CTV article paints a picture that totally contradicts the narrative of this terrified, paralyzed economy.
Yeah, the CTV piece is a perfect hook for this.
You've got Nabur's Gardens, right? A local operation in Montague deciding that the middle of a massive North American trade dispute is the perfect time to start shipping wild island blueberries to store shelves in Asia.
Which is quite the pivot.
And it isn't just produce. True North Seafood is taking smoked salmon and pre-made salmon burgers produced in Charlottetown and placing them in grocery aisles in South Korea and Japan.
The logistics behind a pivot like that are they're immense.
I can imagine.
You don't just put a salmon burger on a plane and hope for the best. You're dealing with incredibly complex cold chain shipping, wildly different food provenance regulations.
Not to mention the language barriers and intense local competition.
Exactly. And the thing is, True North Seafood had actually been eyeing the Asian market for a decade. They knew the potential was there.
Wait, I have to pause you there because that decade-long hesitation is probably the most interesting part of this to me. If they knew the Asian market was viable for 10 years, why wait until the North American trade environment gets toxic to finally make the move?
Right. It seems counterintuitive.
It feels a bit like, trying to learn how to swim only after the boat starts sinking.
It comes down to friction. For years, exporting to the United States was virtually frictionless. I mean, supply chains were already established, the language was the same, the regulations were basically synchronized.
So it's just easy.
Right. When a market is that easy and that lucrative, human nature and business nature really defaults to the path of least resistance.
That makes sense.
The recent shifts and the sheer unpredictability in U.S. trade policy essentially injected friction into that previously smooth system.
Okay, let's unpack this. So the U.S. tariffs basically acted as an alarm clock.
An alarm clock is a great way to put it.
Like, the U.S. market was so comfortable that island exporters were arguably just sleepwalking. But the sudden unpredictability jolted them awake, forced them out of bed, and made them finally book those flights to Tokyo and Seoul.
That is a highly accurate way to frame it. And the Innovation PEI 2025 report shows the tangible result of that awakening.
Because the government stepped in, right?
Yeah, the provincial government recognized this friction was coming, which is why programs like the Export Enhancement and Diversification Fund exist.
How does a fund like that actually work in practice? Because, a government grant doesn't magically put a blueberry in a Tokyo supermarket.
No, it definitely doesn't. What it does is mitigate the massive upfront risk of establishing a new international footprint.
Okay.
The fund physically helps businesses absorb the cost of travel for trade missions, the translation of marketing materials, and the specialized legal consultations required to navigate Japanese or South Korean import laws.
Which are Famously complicated.
Extremely. So when Terry Neighbors went to Asia, or when True North Seafood utilized these missions, they were making direct, face-to-face contacts in markets that place a massive premium on Canadian food provenance.
So our reputation for highly regulated, safe food is essentially a currency over there.
Exactly. It's a huge selling point.
And the data shows this isn't just some anecdotal success story. Like,
Sure.
if you are listening to this and wondering if a few blueberry shipments actually move the macroeconomic needle, the innovation PEI data is wild.
It really is.
In 2025, PEI hit an all-time high of $2.68 billion in international exports. And I want to contrast that with the rest of the country.
This is the crazy part.
Overall, Canadian exports actually decreased by 0.19%. So the country as a whole went backward, while PEI grew its exports by 2.8%.
They are entirely bucking the national trend. But we have to be careful not to misinterpret this pivot.
What do you mean?
Well, the temptation is to view this aggressive move into Asia as some sort of rebellion against the United States, like a retaliatory, we don't need you anymore kind of posturing.
I assume the math makes that kind of posturing literally impossible. I mean, you can't just replace your primary trading partner overnight.
Far from it.
Yeah.
As Terry Neighbors noted in the CPV piece, the shift is really about addressing a critical potential vulnerability. Relying entirely on a single market, regardless of how friendly or historically stable it has been, is inherently dangerous. Diversifying their export baskets doesn't mean abandoning their neighbors. It's a structural reinforcement of the island's long-term economic stability.
To visualize this, I look at it like a boat. You do not throw your boat's anchor overboard just because the water gets a little choppy.
No, that would be a disaster.
The U.S. is the anchor. You keep it. But you realize you might need a secondary motor if the current shifts against you. So Asia is that secondary motor.
That's a perfect analogy.
But if we are building that secondary motor, we need to honestly assess the anchor. Because if you turn on the news, the headline suggests the anchor is dragging us down. The narrative is all about tariff shocks, massive trade deficits, walls going up.
Right, but the innovation PEI data provides a really harsh reality check to those dramatic political headlines.
Okay, hit me with the numbers.
We mentioned PEI hit $2.68 billion in total exports. Out of that record-breaking number, a massive $2.08 billion still goes directly south to the United States.
$2 billion out of 2.6. That is just an astronomical dependency. Who is even in second place?
The Netherlands at roughly $58 million.
Oh, wow. That is not even in the same universe.
Not even close.
So how is trade still flowing so freely when the rhetoric out of Washington is aggressively protectionist? Because I hear numbers like a $45 billion trade deficit that the U.S. has with Canada, and it makes it sound like a punitive trade war is basically inevitable.
This is where we need to bring in the TD Economics report, because it systematically dismantles the hysteria surrounding that deficit.
Okay, how so?
Well, the $45 billion figure is thrown around as if Canada is somehow taking advantage of the United States. But statistically, a $45 billion deficit represents negative 0.2% of the U.S. GDP.
Wow.
To give you a scale, that is 1/8 the size of America's trade deficit with China.
It's a rounding error for an economy that size.
It is entirely negligible in the grand scheme of American macroeconomics.
Yeah.
But beyond the size of the deficit, we have to look at the mechanism of why it even exists.
Right, because a trade deficit isn't a charity payment.
Exactly. The TD report outlines this market dominance context, explaining that the U.S. deficit is largely driven by their own massive demand for Canadian energy, specifically oil, natural gas, and power.
Wait, let me make sure I understand the mechanics of this. The U.S. economy is outperforming. They are building things. They're consuming power.
Yes.
But they physically do not have enough domestic energy to fuel that growth, so they just buy it from Canada.
That is the core mechanism. The deficit is a byproduct of America's own economic success. They are hungry for energy to keep their factories running.
Okay, that makes sense.
And here is the ultimate proof that the whole unfair deficit narrative is flawed. If you remove energy exports from the equation entirely, the United States actually runs a trade surplus with Canada to the tune of about US $45 billion.
Wait, really? So X-Energy, we are actually buying more from them than they are from us?
Exactly.
That completely changes the framing. The U.S. isn't subsidizing Canada. They're just keeping their own lights on.
Spot on. Furthermore, the RBC Economics report shows that despite all the tariff shocks in the news, almost 90% of Canadian exports to the U.S. in 2025 remain completely tariff-free.
Okay, I am stuck on that 90% figure because If you are listening to this from Ontario or Quebec right now, you are probably throwing your phone across the room.
Oh, for sure.
The big smoke manufacturing hubs seem to be in a state of sheer panic over tariffs. If 90% is tariff-free, why is central Canada sweating bullets while PEI just sails through? What is protecting PEI?
It comes down to the fundamental difference in what these regions produce, and more importantly, how those products cross the border.
What do you mean?
Well, the RBC report breaks down the regional impact, showing that Ontario and Quebec face the highest average effective tariff rates in the country, both exceeding 6%.
Okay.
PEI, on the other hand, has an effective tariff rate of less than 1%.
A 6% tax versus a 1% tax. I know auto manufacturing is complex, but why does the border penalize a car part so much more heavily than, say, a potato?
It is the compounding nature of highly integrated manufacturing. In the North American auto sector, a product does not just cross the border once.
Right. It bounces back and forth.
Think about a steering column. The raw materials might be processed in one country, shipped to a second country to be molded into components, shipped back to the first country to be assembled into the steering column, and then shipped to a third country to be installed in the final vehicle.
You are saying a single piece of a car could cross the US-Canada-Mexico border multiple times before the consumer ever turns the key.
7 or 8 times in some cases. Now imagine a seemingly small 2% or 3% tariff being applied every single time that component hits a border checkpoint.
Oh, wow. It compounds.
Exactly. By the time the car is finished, that localized tariff has ballooned into a massive, prohibitive cost. The supply chain is simply too tangled to avoid the friction.
Okay, let's look at the PEI side of the equation. Why doesn't PEI get caught in that same compounding trap?
Because PEI exports fundamentals. They're not exporting carburetors or microchips that require multi-stage cross-border assembly.
Right.
Just look at the top exports listed in the Innovation PEI data. Over $712 million in frozen potatoes and over $258 million in frozen lobster.
Well, yeah, a potato doesn't need to be sent to Detroit to have the skin put on and then sent back to Charlottetown to be frozen.
Exactly.
Ah.
The physical journey is entirely linear. A potato is grown in island soil. It is processed and flash frozen in a local island facility. It's loaded onto a refrigerated truck. It crosses the border exactly one time, and it goes directly to a distributor or restaurant in Boston or New York.
So it triggers a tariff assessment just once.
Right. If the tariff is 1%, the total penalty is just 1%.
And people always need to eat. The U.S. relies heavily on this steady, safe supply of high-quality food. It makes the island's economy incredibly durable against these specific types of trade shocks.
Very durable.
PEI is basically insulated by the lack of complexity in its export journey.
And that insulation is largely protected by the CUSMA agreement, the Canada, the United States, Mexico agreement.
How so?
CSMA dictates the rules of origin. Because a PEI potato or a PEI lobster originates 100% within Canada, it easily clears the strictest CUSMA hurdles. This shields it from the broader executive order tariffs that usually target complex goods containing components from outside North America.
Which brings up a fascinating irony. If you synthesize all of this, the fact that PEI is insulated by its agricultural fundamentals and the fact that the recent unpredictability forced them to successfully open massive new markets in Asia, it leads to a very counterintuitive conclusion.
I think I know where you're going with this.
The current U.S. administration's tough trade stance actually catalyzed PEI's economic evolution. Like, by trying to squeeze their trading partners, they inadvertently did PEI a massive favor.
The data entirely supports that conclusion. A prolonged period of extreme comfort can breed structural fragility.
Yeah, that makes sense.
The U.S. market was so reliable that there was little incentive for smaller island businesses to endure the grueling logistics of expanding across the Pacific. The political theater and the threat of tariffs stripped away that comfort. It forced complacency right out of the system.
So what does this all mean? It sounds like the U.S. trade policy was essentially the strict personal trainer that PEI didn't want, but absolutely needed to get into peak economic shape.
That's a great way to put it.
Or it's like a controlled burn in a forest. If you never let the small fires clear out the dead brush, eventually you get a catastrophic blaze that takes out the old growth trees.
Yes, exactly.
The U.S. trade volatility was a controlled burn. It was uncomfortable, it was scary, but it forced the island to develop deeper, more resilient roots. They had to innovate, they had to utilize the Export Enhancement Fund, and they really had to prove to themselves that they could compete on a global stage outside of the North American bubble.
That is the ultimate glass half-full takeaway here.
Yeah.
You cannot and should not sever the line to your biggest customer because of a temporary political rough patch.
Right, you don't cut the anchor line.
Exactly. When over $2 billion of your economic output relies on a single partner, you protect that anchor at all costs. But you leverage the anxiety of that rough patch. PEI used the threat of disruption to motivate a push toward undeniable self-reliance in other hemispheres.
They kept the anchor, but they fired up the secondary motor. They are no longer entirely captive to the shifting winds of Washington, D.C., and honestly, it is a masterclass in regional economic resilience.
It truly is.
We've traced how the friction of trade tariffs sparked this incredibly lucrative push into Asian markets for products like wild blueberries and smoked salmon. And we've dug into the logistics of why PEI's food fundamentals naturally bypass the compounding tariff traps that are basically suffocating the big multi-border manufacturing hubs.
And most importantly, we've broken down the statistical reality that the core relationship with the U.S. remains fundamentally solid.
Right.
It is driven by genuine, insatiable American demand for reliable energy and safe food, completely separate from the political narratives of subsidies and unfair deficits.
Which leaves us with a final, highly provocative thought for you to consider. The RBC report notes that the CUSMA agreement, the very treaty that dictates those rules of origin and keeps 90% of our exports tariff-free, is not permanent.
No, it is not.
It is set to expire and undergo intense, likely brutal renegotiations ahead of 2036.
Those negotiations will literally define the economic landscape of North America for a generation. The stakes could not be higher.
Historically, if you are a smaller province going into a massive international trade negotiation, you are operating from a profound position of vulnerability. You are a tiny boat just begging not to be crushed by the larger ships.
Right.
But think about the leverage PEI has now. They have mathematically proven that their agricultural exports are practically tariff-proof because they are fundamental necessities. And thanks to this recent disruption, they have successfully fired up that secondary motor in Asia.
They walk into the room with a proven, diversified global roadmap. They are no longer entirely dependent on the goodwill of the CUSMA negotiators.
Exactly. So if you are an island business owner or a local policymaker, how does that newfound leverage change your confidence? How does it change your strategy the next time you sit down at the international table? You aren't just surviving the weather anymore. You know exactly how to harness the wind.
A great point to end on.
A huge thank you to you for joining us today as we bypass the panic of the daily headlines to uncover the actual mechanics of PEI's thriving economy. Until next time, keep digging deeper.